Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to webinar 3 of our Compliance Roadmap 2023 session. My name is Nihal, Samara. I'm the General Counsel and Legal Director here at Kaizen Synergy Law Firm, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's session. As I mentioned, today's session is webinar or episode 3 of our series of governance, risk, and legal compliance webinars that we are running. Today, we're focusing on the governance standard associated with vulnerable people and also dovetailing this into the child safe standards. With that said, as always, we'd like to pay our respects to the elders past and present upon the lands on which we all meet. While this session is being run by webinar and recorded all the way up to the Q&A part of the session, we do pay our respects to the traditional owners accordingly. So today's agenda really focuses on vulnerable people and also dovetailing into the child safe standards. Now, what we always do, just to give you an idea of where we are heading, our recommendations is to review the governance standards. I'll show you what that looks like. Access the Gemba dashboard and continue to work through your self-assessment resource tool that we have, and also look at the policy templates that we are using today. All of these resources are available to all attendees that are joining us. It is a single seat that you yourselves do have in order to be able to access these resources and also ask us any questions that you might have. So that said, let me just jump in and show you where we are actually heading and what are the resources that your agency does actually have access to. So I will just bring this up for you to be able to view, and this way you know exactly where we are heading. First of all, with the resources, and I'll just bring this slide up here, thank you, is that you do have essentially the access to the Gemba dashboard. You have access to the legal policy documents and checklists that we have. And also, if you want, you can actually book in sessions directly with us to go through any of your questions and also meet with us to go through any of the resources that you have questions on. So you will get, after today's session, a copy of the resource. You will also have a link that takes you through to this slide here and allows you to select which dates you want as well too. So if I wanted to do this, let's say next Wednesday, oh my goodness, we're almost on the 1st of Feb next week, and book in at say 10 o'clock, then you can do that and just complete your details. And this will automatically generate you a calendar invite with a Zoom link that'll connect directly to us. So you do have access to be able to actually view this resource as well too, and essentially be able to actually access the appointment that you want to see as well. So that is certainly there for you to be able to view and access those resources as you need to. The other part of this that you do have access to is also the dashboard. Now, one of the things that you will be able to see, here it is here, and you can log in using your email address as well too. I'll just do that here. This is into our demo site. And if we bring this up, I'll show you a couple of the resources that we're going to actually use today and you do have access to on this. So here we are here. A couple of the resources. First of all, let's have a look at the policy document. The safeguarding policy template can be found in the Gemba docs. You can go into the policy and resources. As we move through the different governance topics, you will see these. I'm just going to go into the safeguarding folder, and here is the policy document that I can then open up. This allows you to keep it open. Here we are here, and I'll just make this a view for you to be able to see. We will come back to this as well. So I'm just opening this up and I'll leave this open. But essentially, this is a policy template covering safeguarding and vulnerable people. We will go through this in today's session, definitions of what a vulnerable person is, as well as early identifications and operational management, some key areas that you should be looking as part of your governance policy set for safeguarding vulnerable people. Just going back to the dashboard as well too, And the other part of this is the governance, risk, and legal compliance checklist. And if you click on that icon, you'll see that we've got the cybersecurity from last week, and now also we've got the safeguarding checklist and some of the key things that your agency does need to be aware of. So those are the resources that you do have access to. Certainly that will be made available after today's session with yourselves this afternoon. So just going back to the slides, you do have access to make a time with us, certainly, in order to get some support or even ask legal questions that you might have. You've also got access to the dashboard and also some of the legal templates that we're talking about today. So essentially, we covered off cybersecurity, what it is, and that was our topic from last week. We're now going into the governance standards and extending this specifically on and into safeguarding vulnerable persons. So when we talk of governance standards, and we went through this over the past few weeks, we looked at what corporate governance is, what the roles are, essentially what the requirements are for ASIC and registered and also ORIC registered companies. We also looked at what the duties are under the 6 specific standards, and focused on one of those, specifically being the legal obligations that directors and officers have. There is a focus on 4 key areas, these being financial abuse, cybersecurity, working with partners, and safeguarding vulnerable people. Next week, we will be looking at working with partners after there has been some substantive changes in that space. But today, we're going to be looking at safeguarding vulnerable people. A lot of this does come back to risk management, and we will be having a session on organizational risk reporting in the upcoming weeks. So if we do look at the different specific standards, one of these that we can see is on safeguarding vulnerable people. Now, the issue that a lot of agencies essentially have is, what does it actually cover, and why are we focused on this particular topic? Well, we're focused on this particular topic quite simply because safeguarding is protecting the welfare and human rights of people that are in some ways connected with a charity or its work, and it is a part of a charity's primary duty to ensure that it protects vulnerable people. Now, charities must be able to recognize vulnerability in its staff, as well as volunteers, beneficiaries, and partners. Now, these obligations actually came directly from the government regulatory sites. And what I essentially mean by that is that there are rules and requirements that we see in all different agencies that essentially agencies must actually follow. And one of the challenges that we do find, and I will just bring up this particular slide for you, just going back, is essentially when agencies do need to carefully consider the rules and responsibilities following governance, risk, and compliance workflows. And we often find that when we're looking at agencies and their rules of what they need to look at, essentially there are legislation, there's ministerial order, regulators, and policy directives. And this is how we've actually set up the compliance checklists. The other big issue, though, for agencies like yourselves in the charity space, and you would have seen me use this slide last week, is essentially looking at, well, who is actually looking at you? And what I mean by that is the ACNC, which manages and oversees charities, is just one part. But if you're working in disability services, then there are vulnerable obligations that you need to meet under the NDIS. If you're working in Indigenous, registered as an ORIC registered corporation for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, then there's another policy directive coming out of that regulator for vulnerable persons. There's also, if your staff are registered with APRA, and again, there are policies that different regulators have. So when I talk about, well, actually looking at essentially this slide here and saying, well, what does the governance standards actually mean for you in your agency? Well, then it looks like there's only one piece of legislation and ministerial orders and one regulator that you're essentially dealing with if we look at the left-hand side. But the reality of what you actually see is this slide here, where there's multiple regulators essentially looking at you. So what we have done to support your agency in this is to actually bring it, and if I bring it back to the Gemba dashboard, and I'm actually going to jump now into the operational side of this governance, risk and compliance obligations, is to bring across this governance, risk and compliance checklist. And it is something, as I said, it's a single seat that your agency can use in order to access this. Now I'm just going to click on add a new entry, and yourselves can access this afternoon. So when you go in, and we'll just work through working with partners, we're looking at, that's next week, we're looking at safeguarding checklist, excuse me. Then essentially what we need to look at is here. And we've actually taken different regulatory requirements, looked at the legislation, and pulled this together for you into answering this as a yes or no type question. So you should be having a documented safeguarding risk assessment, including for specific programs and events if necessary. You need to have a register of your legal obligations and an action plan and a clear safeguarding policy. And this is all directives coming out of different regulators that you can see. We have built this off the ACNC, and we're not affiliated with any regulator in any way, which allows us to provide some comment into the effectiveness of some of the different regulatory bodies in terms of their tools and resources. It also means that you need to look at things like awareness raising and measures to ensure that people in the charity understand the charity's risk and expectations. But how do you in fact do this? Well, then you should be able to, first of all, answer yes to all of these. But the big question that agencies then come back to us on is, well, where is the line in the sand for this? Now, as I mentioned, what we do have on here is in the Gemba Docs is this screen here. And these are resources that are open for you to be able to use today. So when you go in, you can have access to the safeguarding policy. And if I open this up, here it is here, and I'll just slide this into the screen for you. And you can see it's a Word document. And I'm just going to click on Enable Editing, okay? So it's a document template that you can use. Now, what we have done is look at, first of all, and I'll just bring this into page width for us to be able to go through it, okay? So you can add it in and you can change this. You can use all or nothing if you like, but it gives you an idea of some of the key areas. So what we have started to do, first of all, and let me drill down into this, is the governance standards. So what is actually covered? Well, we've verbatim cut and pasted the information out in terms of the checklist items. So safeguarding policy, code of conduct, policies, etc., of what you see here. Now, what we have done is, what is the objectives of the policy? To ensure that vulnerable persons are supported during service delivery at your agency, and to ensure that the inherent dignity of vulnerable persons are respected. We've also looked at what the definition of essentially a vulnerable person is. And importantly from this, what we have also looked at is minors, physical or social abuse, sensory impairment, mental illness, intellectual development and learning disabilities, and physical disabilities. So essentially what this brings in together, if I bring this back, is essentially all of the different regulatory requirements that you can see across the board. And when I go back to this slide here it is here, again, we've picked and chosen what are the core vulnerable population policy documents across the board and brought them together into a policy document for you. What it also looks at is the things of policy elements. So this is things like early identification of vulnerable persons. So it's one thing from a legal obligation to be able to say, yes, we can identify or define what a vulnerable person is. But once we've done that, well, how do we actually identify it? How do we actually look at who needs to do what and what is the specific requirement that we need to find across this as well too. And you might change this wording of this policy, but it gives you an idea of how to identify a vulnerable person at your agency. The last thing that we've done, and we've tried to keep it as simple as possible for you, is to essentially look at the operational management of this. So it's one thing, and I've seen this from a quality service and compliance point of view, you can have all these systems and policies in place, but essentially, how do you actually put this into practice? What is the operational obligations that your agency does need to have? So we've actually broadened this because it is, remember, a governance standard requirement. We've actually included your board members and members, as well as contractors and volunteers, to ensure that they're across what they actually need to look at, as well as incident reporting and risk management. Now, managing risks, and you'll see that we've included things like notifying board members receiving and investigating abuse and neglect and exploitation. We've looked at things like who to report to as well too, in terms of safeguarding. What is your monitoring and review obligations as well too. And also we've mentioned things like incident reporting and feedbacks, and essentially signing off by the CEO. So on the policy document, you can see we've got some pretty clear specific requirements. There may well be other things that your agency does need to look at. And one of those, if I jump back to the dashboard here, one of those might actually be things like you may need to run your incident reports as well too, for actually notifying and identifying vulnerable persons. And you can use Gemba to do that as well too. We'll cover that in the upcoming weeks. And also look at things like feedback forms that you might have as well too, in actually being able to manage the feedback of complaints as well. So by doing this, what you essentially have is the ability to be able to manage your policy and reporting requirements directly on Gemba in terms of what you need to do. In terms of the policy feedback, what we find and what is important in terms of the specific governance standards is looking at each of these requirements. And each of these requirements specifically focus back on the governance, risk, and compliance form. So again, the self-assessment tool in terms of what you need to meet is looking at the specific checklist of being able to answer, do you have a documented process? Do you have a register of your legal obligations? Do you have a safeguarding policy? And remember, what is your policy, procedures, and systems to introduce controls within your agency? So these are all things that are taken directly off your governance, risk, and compliance obligations. When we look at what are the responsibilities that agencies have in terms of this reporting, you can see what we do need to look at is essentially meeting all of the current requirements under this particular slide here, and looking at all of the regulators and essentially managing what your reporting obligations are. So when we come back and actually summarize this, looking at your agency's reporting requirements and actually looking at the essentially the system that you need in terms of safeguarding your own vulnerable persons requirements, what you need to view at and actually see is essentially ensuring that you meet all of your legal compliance obligations and ensure that you do have your systems in place to be able to actually manage and safeguard your specific obligations from your agency. Now, when we bring this up under the specific issue of safeguarding vulnerable persons, as I mentioned at the start, the core governance requirement that your agency does need to look at is ensuring safeguarding is protecting the welfare and human rights of people that are in some ways connected with your charity or its work, and it is a part of a charity's primary duty of care. And this came directly from the ACNC's guidelines. So this is where your agency does need to show how it actually meets this and ensure that you mitigate these risks. And essentially we have taken this directly out of the specific agency's reporting requirements. What we also show is, and we will come back to this next week, is in terms of the regulators and what your agency does need to carefully consider. That said, we do suggest that you look at the specific tools as well too that are coming out of your session, and also specifically focus on the reporting requirements that your agency does need to consider. We are aware that you do need to look at the partnering of agencies' obligations and the governance standards that your agency needs to look at. And what we are covering off next week is essentially exactly that. So we are going to break down what your obligations are, looking at your partnering obligations, and essentially covering those requirements into the training as well. I will just add, as part of this session, that we do want to actually show you how other agencies met the requirements for the child safe standards. And this is something that your agency will have access to as well. We do want to use the case study of actually the SMRC, which is a Southern Migrant and Resource Centre down in Melbourne. Now, one of the big training sessions that they actually rolled out to agencies was essentially their child safe standards. And this gives your agencies access to be able to view all of this. So in the Gemba College that you do have access to, there is the child safe training standards. And in this is specific for your agency. By clicking on training, will give you access to your agency's specific child safe training, and it's divided into a number of different areas. These include child safe training for all staff, child safe training for volunteers, and child safe standards training for board members. These are specific training sessions that focus on all of the different 11 standards. They go for, some of them go for 20 minutes in length, so I'm not going to cover them off here. But essentially, these resources are there for you to be able to view and cover off the specific policy trainings that your agency does also need to look at, and ties it back to the vulnerable population groups in supporting your agency. And you can view that in the Gemba College, and this is accessible for all agencies to be able to use. I will add that the SMRC actually rolled this out to their staff starting last week, and actually had over 100 odd people complete the training within only a couple of days in order to be able to do it. So it is an excellent work of something that was rolled out within only a few days, and something that was taken up very, very quickly by agency staff. So with it, what our recommendations are is review the governance standards, look at your Gemba 360 dashboard, and conduct the self-assessment using the governance tool. If you do have any questions, you can make a booking with us directly. We will be sending out the recordings of this webinar after today's live session, along with the opportunity to actually meet with us directly and for us to walk you through the resources and set this up and answer any legal questions that you might have. Next week's session is on partnering agency standards. If you do have any questions, more than happy to stay online and answer those now. If you are watching this recording after today's live session, then thank you for joining us. If you do have any questions, reach out to us at support@gemba360.com or telephone us on 1300 360 360.